This story involves a retired forest ranger, a winter night, and something that shouldn't exist according to everything she believed. It changed her. It might change you. The wind had teeth that night. Margaret Ellen Thorne had been driving these mountains for 37 years, since before her father died and left her the station, before her marriage cracked like thin ice, before the years stacked up so heavy, she stopped counting them as separate things and started thinking of her life as one long season without a Sunday. But tonight the wind was something else. It came down from the ridge with purpose, with knowledge, carrying the particular cold that only comes when a storm is so far beyond human scale that fear becomes a luxury you can't afford. The snow fell sideways in long, vicious sheets that her headlights couldn't find their way through. It was the kind of weather that made the road vanish, made you wonder if the road had ever really been there at all. Her truck groaned through a curve, chains biting the ice underneath. The green paint was faded now, same color as the State Forest Service had used for 30 years, and the heater rattled but didn't quit. She kept her hands steady on the wheel the way her father had taught her. The way his hands had been steady until the cancer made them shake. The way she'd learned steadiness was sometimes all you had between life and the ditch. The radio crackled with dead air. Static and the sound of her own breathing, shallow and controlled. She'd been headed back to the ranger station when the storm moved in faster than the forecast had promised. There was no one left at the station to worry. Her partner, James, had taken early retirement 3 years ago and moved to Arizona. The volunteers were seasonal. In winter, when the park was locked down and the tourists gone, it was just Margaret and the forest and the stretching hours of a woman who'd learned to like her own company because the alternative was unbearable. She'd done this drive 100 times, knew every switchback, every drainage, every place where the earth wanted to slide into the gullies and take you with it. But something about tonight felt different. The mountains held a different kind of silence. The snow seemed to be falling with intention, not random but directed, like it was trying to bury something before it could be found. Her father used to say there were nights when the land remembered. Nights when the snow came not just to cover but to preserve something it didn't want to let go of. She hadn't thought about him in months, hadn't let herself think about him since she'd cleaned out the station office and found his old journals, the ones filled with marks and measurements and notes that didn't quite add up to anything, but hinted at something he'd never quite found the words to explain. She leaned forward, squinting through the white wall. The headlights carved a tunnel through the dark, but only a few feet ahead. Beyond that was nothing. Beyond that was the possibility of error. Georgetown Lake should have been visible on her right by now, but the storm had erased all geography. There was just the road, just the snow, just the sound of the engine grinding through another gear as the slope steepened. That's when she saw it. At first it was nothing, just a shape against the snow, something dark where everything should have been white. Her foot lifted from the gas, and the truck began to slow. The tires caught on a patch where the snow had frozen to ice, and for a moment the whole machine drifted, and Margaret's heart moved into her throat the way it did sometimes in dreams, that falling feeling, the loss of ground. She straightened it out, eased the truck to the shoulder, tires crunching on gravel that the snow hadn't quite buried yet. The engine ticked and cooled, the heater died down to a whisper, and in the sudden quiet, there was only the wind and the tick of metal and the sound of her own breathing fast now, elevated, the breathing of a body that recognizes danger even when the mind hasn't caught up yet. The shape shifted, not much, just barely, but enough that she knew it was alive. Margaret reached for the flashlight under the seat, pulled it out, opened the door into a blast of cold that took her breath and made her knees want to buckle. She was 68 years old. She'd been through blizzards and spring floods and the forest burning on 2 different occasions. She'd pulled people out of wrecks and animals from traps and lived alone for so long that silence had become her native language. But the cold tonight was something different. It had a weight to it that pressed against her ribs like a hand, like something was trying to push its way inside. She pointed the flashlight toward the shape. The beam caught fur first. Dark, matted, moving slightly with breath that steamed in the frozen air. Then it caught an arm. But not an arm like any arm she'd ever seen. This was massive, thick-muscled, covered in that same dark fur, and the hand at the end of it had 5 fingers, actual fingers, with joints and knuckles, but they were enormous. They were the size of a man's foot. The nails were cracked and bleeding, split deep at the edges, and the palm was scarred in a way that suggested work, which suggested intention, which suggested thought. Margaret's throat went dry. She moved closer without making a conscious decision to do so. Her body was doing things her mind was still negotiating with. She crouched down in the snow, her 70-year-old knees protesting, her breath coming in small clouds that the wind immediately shredded into nothing. The hand flinched away from her, but just barely. The creature made a sound, then a groan, but not like any animal she'd ever heard. This was something closer to pain, but also something else. Something old, something that carried weight beyond the physical. She had maybe 2 seconds to decide. The old training kicked in, ranger training from decades ago, basic wildlife management, the protocol for encountering an injured animal. You don't approach, you don't touch, you call it in and let someone else handle it. You protect yourself first because you're no good to anyone dead or infected or turned into a meal. But her father's voice came through then, not words exactly, just the feeling of his presence, the weight of his steadiness. And she saw herself in the station office again, looking at those journals, those marks that now made a kind of terrible sense. Marks that suggested he'd been tracking something, documenting something, trying to prove something about the woods that the world refused to believe. Margaret reached out and moved the snow away from the creature's shoulder. The flesh underneath was burning hot fever, infection, the heat of a body in crisis. She could see where something had torn into it, a jagged wound near the ribs where old blood had crusted, and new blood was still seeping. And embedded in that wound, rusted and cruel, was a piece of barbed steel the size of a railroad spike, curved like it had come from a fence, meant to contain something much larger than cattle. "Jesus," she whispered. She stood, moved to the truck, and pulled out every blanket she had, old wool things her mother had made, canvas emergency supplies, a tarp that had seen better decades. She wrapped them around the creature as best she could, careful around the wound, careful not to aggravate whatever damage was already done. The body was massive. Dead weight would have been impossible, but there was a winch on the front of the truck, and Margaret had learned a long time ago that most problems were just puzzles that hadn't revealed their solution yet. It took 20 minutes. The snow kept falling. Her hands went numb and then stopped hurting, which was somehow worse. The creature didn't fight her. It just lay there, breathing that strange, labored breath, and let her work. By the time she had it secured in the bed of the truck and covered with everything she owned that might keep it warm, her fingers didn't work right, and her shoulders felt like they'd been separated from her spine. The ranger station was 12 miles north. She knew that distance the way she knew the lines on her own palms. She drove it slow, careful not to jar the truck too much, keeping her eye on the mirror to make sure nothing shifted back there. The storm was moving northeast, which meant it would blow through by morning. That was something. That was one thing she could count on. The cabin was dark when she arrived. She'd left it that way, didn't see the point in heating an empty room, and the cold inside was so complete it felt like a presence. She'd lived alone so long that even rooms with no people in them felt crowded by her solitude, that accumulation of empty years pressing against the walls. She got the creature inside on the floor, not on any of the furniture, because that felt like crossing a line into something she wasn't ready to name. She wrapped it in every blanket again, built up the fire, and stood there breathing hard, her whole body shaking with cold and adrenaline, and something else she couldn't quite identify, but that felt like stepping off a cliff into darkness. That's when it opened its eyes. They were large, dark, and impossibly aware. They looked at her the way eyes shouldn't look, with intelligence behind them, with history, with the kind of recognition that comes from memory. The creature's massive chest rose and fell, and then, slowly, with a deliberation that made her heart stop, It raised one enormous hand toward its own chest, placed it flat against the fur and matted blood, then moved that hand toward her. The palm came to rest directly over her heart. Margaret didn't move. Her breath caught somewhere in her throat and simply stopped. They stayed like that, a woman in her 70th year, and a creature that shouldn't exist, according to everything she believed in, locked in a silence that carried more meaning than any words ever could. She could feel the heat from its hand, the massive weight of it, the deliberate pressure, and underneath that, she could feel something else. Something like a vow being made, something like a promise being passed from one being to another. When the hand pulled away, Margaret realized she was crying, though she couldn't remember when that had started. She made tea, real tea, not the instant garbage she'd been drinking for years, and sat by the fire and waited to see if the creature would live or die. Around 3 a.m., there was a sound outside, a crunch of snow, a movement at the edge of the light thrown by the cabin's outside lamp. Margaret went to the window and looked out into the darkness. There was a shape there, massive, perfectly still, standing at the tree line, silhouetted against the white, watching the cabin with an intensity that Margaret could feel like a physical pressure against her sternum. She didn't breathe. She didn't move. She just looked back at the shape in the trees and understood, in a way that bypassed rational thought entirely, that something had shifted in her world, that the clean lines between known and unknown had just become very blurred, that the mountains had finally shown her the thing her father had spent his whole life trying to find. Then the creature on the floor made a sound. Low, not pain, not fear, something deeper. A call. The shape in the trees didn't move, but Margaret swore she felt it answer. Somehow, in a frequency too low to hear but somehow impossible to miss. She pulled the curtains closed and tried not to think about what was happening. She tried not to think about what was waiting in the dark. She tried not to think about the fact that her father had found this thing or been found by it, and that perhaps the thing he'd been chasing for his entire life had simply been waiting for him to understand that the chase was a two-way street. The kerosene stove hissed, the fire crackled low, and outside, the snow kept falling, and something in the darkness kept watch. Something that knew her name, somehow. Something that had been waiting a very long time for a woman like her to find what it had been trying to tell the world. By morning, Margaret understood that her life had cracked open into before and after, and there was no going back to the version of herself that had existed before the snow and the storm and the massive hand placed against her heart, like a blessing or a curse or something for which she'd never been given the words. Part 2. The Reckoning. The sun came up thin and pale, the way it does after a storm has spent itself. The snow had stopped sometime in the small hours. Outside, the world was white and clean and utterly without mercy. Margaret hadn't slept. She'd sat by the fire, adding wood when it burned low, watching the creature breathe in the shallow, labored way of something fighting to stay tethered to the living world. The wound was worse in daylight. Now she could see the extent of it, the way the infection had spread through the tissue in dark tributaries, the fever that still radiated from its body like something alive, inside something alive, eating it from within. By 8 in the morning, she knew what she had to do, and she hated herself for knowing it. She picked up the radio and called the clinic in Missoula. Dr. Patricia Vance had been her neighbor for almost 15 years, back when Margaret could afford to care about having neighbors. They'd shared coffee maybe twice. Margaret had attended Pat's birthday party once and felt out of place the entire time. But Pat was the best at what she did: wildlife medicine. Rescue, the kind of work that mattered in a way most jobs didn't. And more importantly, Pat asked fewer questions than most people Margaret knew. "This is Thorne," Margaret said into the radio. "I need you to come to the station. Medical emergency. It's not human." There was a pause. Margaret could almost hear Pat thinking through the possibilities. Bear attack. Mountain lion encounter. One of the elk herds that sometimes got into trouble during hard winters. How bad? Pat's voice came back, professional and steady, life-threatening. But I think it can be saved. I think you're the only person who can save it. Another pause. Longer this time. I'll be there in 4 hours. Don't do anything until I arrive. Margaret set down the radio and looked at the creature. Its eyes had closed sometime during the night. It wasn't exactly sleeping. The breathing was too irregular, too labored, but it was somewhere between consciousness and whatever came after. She found herself wondering what dreams looked like from inside a creature like this. What memories haunted it? Whether it had a family, whether the shape in the trees last night had been family, or guardian, or something else entirely. Something for which the English language had never bothered to make a word. She made coffee and drank it standing at the window, looking out at the mountains. They were beautiful in a way that broke something in her chest. She'd spent her whole life in these mountains, and never once had she felt like they belonged to her. They tolerated her presence. They allowed her to work among them. But they kept their secrets. They kept them the way her father had kept his, close and careful, and only revealed when the time was right or the cost was high enough. Pat arrived at noon, pulling up in a veterinary truck that had seen better days. She was 65 if she was a day, with the kind of face that suggested she smiled more when she was alone than when she was with people. She was wearing coveralls and carried a bag that probably weighed 30 pounds, and when she walked through the cabin door, she didn't say hello. She just looked at the creature on the floor and stopped moving entirely. "What the hell is that?" she whispered. "I don't know," Margaret said. "But it's dying, I think. I'm not sure. I don't know." Pat set down her bag and approached slowly, the way a person approaches something that might explode or vanish or do something equally sudden and final. She crouched beside the creature and examined it with the kind of attention that suggested she was used to looking at things that shouldn't exist. "The wound," she said finally. "That's livestock-grade barbed steel, military surplus fence. The kind people use to contain things that are valuable or dangerous or both." "Traps?" Margaret asked. "Worse than traps. Someone was keeping this thing. Someone had containment infrastructure." Pat peeled back the blankets and examined the wound more closely. "This infection is bad. Real bad. Sepsis is probably already setting in." "How long has it been like this?" "I don't know. Hours? A day?" It came out of the storm and Margaret stopped. She was about to say something that didn't make sense. Something about how the creature had gotten itself to the road on purpose, how it had wanted to be found. She didn't say that. Instead, she said, "I found it last night." Pat was pulling supplies from her bag now, antibiotics, sterile gauze, something that looked like a local anesthetic. Her hands moved with the kind of muscle memory that comes from years of doing something precisely the same way. She worked quickly, and she didn't ask questions. Not yet. She cleaned the wound, removed the embedded steel with a surgical precision that made Margaret's teeth ache just watching it, and then she packed it with medication and wrapped it clean. The creature didn't wake through any of this. It just lay there, breathing, existing, suspended between recovery and the long descent into nothing. "It needs fluids," Pat said when she was done, "and antibiotics, and probably a blood transfusion, if I can figure out what blood type something like this even has. But the immediate infection is stabilized." She sat back on her heels and looked at Margaret. "Now you want to tell me what this is?" "No," Margaret said. "I don't." Pat nodded, like she'd expected that answer. "Okay then. Different question. Who put that fence in its side? And what did they think they were containing?" Margaret went to the back room, to the small office that had been her father's before he died, and opened the file cabinet. She'd never looked at what was inside. She'd been too afraid of what she might find, or maybe too afraid of what she wouldn't find, but she knew it was there: the journals, the marked maps, the photographs he'd taken but never shown anyone. She came back with a folder, yellowed and worn. Inside were photographs from the 1,980 seconds, printed on photo paper that had faded but survived. The images showed a valley deep in the mountains, maybe 15 miles west of the station. There were clearings with structures. There were things that looked like pens or cages, and there were footprints. massive footprints, laid out with a ruler for scale, documented with the obsessive precision of a man who knew that what he was seeing would never be believed by anyone. Pat went through the photographs slowly. When she spoke, her voice was different, quieter, like something inside her had shifted. "Your father," she said. "He was looking for this. I think he found it. I think he found pieces of it. But I don't think he ever made people understand what he'd found. Because they wouldn't have," Pat said. "Because what we're suggesting here is impossible. It's a creature that science says doesn't exist. It's a thing that goes against everything we've built our certainty on." Pat looked at the photographs again. "But it exists. Here, in this cabin, wounded, trusting you to save its life." They sat with that for a long time. The fire crackled low. Outside, the wind was dying down. The mountains were settling back into their usual silence, the kind of silence that suggests nothing important ever happens, that the land is just land and nothing more. "There's more," Margaret said. She showed Pat the journals. Her father's handwriting, careful and precise, documenting sightings and behavior patterns and theories about migration and territory. Pages and pages of a man trying to make sense of something that defied sense. Somewhere near the end of the last journal, a single sentence in darker ink. "They're not monsters. We are. We're the ones who made them that. We're the ones who couldn't leave them alone." Pat read that and closed the journal carefully, the way you close something sacred. "We need to talk about the ownership question," she said finally. "Someone put that fence in this creature. Someone had it contained, which means someone is going to be looking for it. I know, which means we need to decide if we're harboring it or turning it in. And we need to decide that right now, because once we do one or the other, the direction of this whole thing is set." Margaret looked at the creature. It was still unconscious, still breathing, that shallow, labored breathing, still hanging on to life by threads that looked like they were made of nothing but stubbornness and the determination of something that refused to die in captivity. "My father spent his whole life documenting this thing," Margaret said. "He never reported it, never told anyone. He just watched and recorded and kept his mouth shut. And when he died, I found all of this, and I didn't do anything either. I just filed it away and tried to pretend I'd never seen it. And now I found something on the road that looked like it was dying. Now I saved it because it was right in front of me, and not saving it would have been a kind of cruelty I wasn't willing to live with. That's all I know. That's all I'm willing to commit to knowing." Pat stood, moved to the window, and looked out at the mountains. "There's a place," she said, "near the Canadian border. National parkland that's been designated wilderness. Almost no human presence. It's where things like this should be, if things like this exist." "They exist," Margaret said. "I know. The question is, do we let them stay that way?" By the time the sun was starting to think about setting, the creature had woken, its eyes opened to darkness and confusion, and it made a sound that wasn't quite pain but carried its memory. Margaret had been sitting beside it, waiting, her hand on the blanket without actually touching. When those eyes found her, she saw the moment of recognition, the memory, the understanding that this was the person who had pulled it from the snow. The creature's massive hand reached out, slowly, as if movement cost something. It found the blanket and pulled it aside, revealing the bandaged wound. Margaret had watched Pat work for hours, had seen her use techniques that might have come from veterinary medicine or might have come from somewhere deeper, somewhere more instinctive. The wound was clean now. The infection was still there but retreating, backing away, losing its foothold. The creature looked at the wound and then looked at Margaret. Its eyes were ancient. They were tired, but underneath that, there was something that looked like gratitude mixed with something else. Something like sorrow. "It's going to be okay," Margaret said. "You're going to live." Pat came out from the back room, where she'd been setting up a makeshift IV stand. She stopped when she saw the creature awake, and she moved slowly, giving it space, not crowding it with her presence. The creature looked at her, and then looked back at Margaret, and something passed between them, some understanding that was too deep for words. "We need to move it," Pat said. "Not tonight. Tomorrow. Once it's stronger. There's a place, about 60 miles north. National forest land. Private land, actually, owned by a conservation trust. They have facilities for injured animals, and they have people who know not to ask questions." "People who know about this?" Margaret asked. "People who know about lots of things. People who've learned that the world is stranger and more complicated than most people are willing to admit." Margaret called in sick to the district office. Said she'd picked up a stomach bug, might be down for a week or more. It wasn't a lie exactly. Something was wrong with her stomach. Something was twisted up inside of her. Something that might never go back to exactly where it had been. The next morning, the creature tried to stand. It couldn't. The legs gave out after a few steps, and it went down carefully, controlled, not panicked. It was weak. It was recovering from more than just infection and wounds. There was something deeper, something that suggested captivity. Captivity of a very particular kind. Pat spent the morning finding a trailer, something with a covered bed and good suspension, something that could move an animal without causing further trauma. By noon, she had one. By 2 in the afternoon, they had the creature loaded. It went willingly, which might have been the saddest thing Margaret had ever witnessed. It went like it understood that compliance was survival, like it had learned that lesson somewhere along the way and had internalized it into its very being. They drove north with Pat following in her truck. Margaret kept her hand on the back of the trailer, even though that made no sense. She couldn't feel anything through the metal, but she kept it there anyway, as if touch could be transmitted through material, as if it could become presence. The facility was a low building set back in the pines, camouflaged the way something camouflages itself when it wants to be hidden. A woman met them in the yard, someone in her late 50s, weather-beaten, with eyes that had seen things that most people never see. She didn't introduce herself. She didn't ask questions. She just looked at the creature and nodded and made space. "How long can you keep it?" Margaret asked. "As long as it needs. We have people who specialize in traumatized animals. We have people who understand recovery and rehabilitation. We have people who know that some creatures need to be returned to wildness, that captivity is a kind of death even if the heart keeps beating." The woman led the creature into the facility. It walked slow, but it walked. It looked back once at Margaret, and in that look was something that felt final. Something like goodbye. Something like a thank you that was also a release. Margaret drove back to the ranger station with Pat following. They didn't talk much. There wasn't much to say. Margaret pulled into the station parking lot and found that Pat had turned around. Pat's truck was heading south, back toward Missoula, back toward a life that made more sense than this one. Inside the cabin, there was a stain on the floor where the creature had been lying. Margaret cleaned it with a rag and thought about her father. She wondered if he'd felt this way when he'd found whatever he'd found. If he'd felt this strange mixture of confirmation and loss, this sense of having had proof of something that destroyed the world you thought you knew while leaving you unable to share that destruction with anyone else. She made coffee. Then she went to the back office and opened the journals again, reading through pages and pages of careful documentation. Her father had filled 5 notebooks, 5 years of work, 5 years of documenting a creature that might not exist, 5 years of building a case for something that he knew no one would believe. Near the end of the last notebook, there was an entry dated just 3 weeks before he died. The handwriting was shakier, like his hands had already started their final betrayal. "I saw it today. Not the creature itself that hasn't happened in months, but I saw the path it takes. I see it clearly now. It moves through the mountains like it's following a map that only it knows. It understands the land in a way we never will. It knows the seasons and the patterns, and the places where humans don't go. It's not hiding from us. It's simply living in the spaces we haven't destroyed yet. And if we're very lucky, it will never trust us enough to let us destroy those spaces too." Margaret closed the journal. She looked around the cabin that had been her home for so long that she couldn't remember living anywhere else. The furniture was old. The paint was faded. The windows looked out on mountains that had never answered a single question she'd ever asked them. She packed a bag, just the essentials. Clothes, her father's journals, her ranger credentials, though she wasn't sure she'd be needing those anymore. By evening, she'd locked up the station. She'd left a note for the district office saying she was taking early retirement, effective immediately. She'd made arrangements for her small savings to go to the conservation trust that was now caring for the creature. When she drove away from the station for the last time, the sun was going down. The mountains were turning purple and gold in the fading light. Somewhere up there, in the high valleys and the dense forests, the creature was probably moving, probably testing its legs, probably remembering what it meant to be free. Margaret drove north. She wasn't sure where she was going exactly, but as the miles accumulated and the sun disappeared and the mountains became darker and less certain, she found herself thinking about her father. She found herself understanding, in a way that transcended explanation, why he'd kept his silence, why he'd documented and recorded but never reported, why he'd lived his entire adult life protecting something that the world didn't know it needed protecting. The road stretched out ahead of her. The headlights carved a tunnel through the dark, and somewhere behind her, at the station, the wind came down off the ridge and pushed snow around the empty cabin and pressed itself against the windows like something trying to get in or get out, like something had changed in the mountains themselves, had shifted when she decided to believe. Like the land itself was recognizing that one human had finally learned to keep its secrets. 2 months later, Margaret was working at the facility. She had a small cabin set back in the trees. She had supplies that came monthly. She had work that mattered, caring for animals that had been hurt by human hands, helping them remember how to be wild. The creature had healed. Its wound had closed clean. Its strength had returned, but it didn't try to escape. It moved through a large enclosure and seemed content just to exist in a space that wasn't a cage, that was defined by trees and sky rather than bars and wire. Margaret watched it sometimes, standing at the fence line in the early morning when the mist was still thick and the world was just barely becoming visible. The creature would move through the trees like it was following a path only it could see, like it was practicing something, like it was preparing. One morning in late spring, she found a symbol scratched into the post by the fence. 3 triangles nested inside each other, lines extending outward like veins. She'd seen that symbol before, in her father's journal, in a photograph from the 1980 seconds, a marking that suggested intention, that suggested communication, that suggested something trying to tell the world what it wanted the world to know. She didn't report it. She didn't take it as a sign or a message or anything that required interpretation. She just saw it and understood that the creature was marking the territory in its own way, claiming space, leaving its signature on the world it was learning to exist in again. 3 months after that, the creature was gone. Margaret found the fence open and the enclosure empty and tracks leading north into the deep forest. She followed them for a mile, maybe 2, until they disappeared into territory that even she, with all her years of ranger training, couldn't navigate. But before the tracks disappeared completely, she saw something else. A clearing where multiple creatures had been, where multiple sets of prints converged. She counted at least 4 different animals, 4 different sizes, 4 different weights pressing into the earth. The family had found it. The shape that had watched the cabin that winter night had found the creature that had been stolen. The creature had healed. The creature had remembered. And now the creature had rejoined the only society that mattered, the ancient circuit of family, of memory, of belonging. Margaret stood in the clearing for a long time, not moving, just breathing in the forest air, and understanding that this was the way things should end. Not with resolution, but with return. Not with answers, but with the acceptance that some mysteries were meant to stay mysterious. She walked back to the facility. She didn't report the escape. She didn't file paperwork. She just marked it down in her own personal journal, the way her father had marked down his discoveries, as a thing that had happened, a thing that mattered, a thing that could never be proven or explained, but that had changed everything about the world, at least for those of us who'd been wise enough to believe without needing proof. Some truths are too large to fit inside words. Some mysteries are bigger and more important than any answer could ever be. Margaret Thorne had spent 37 years as a ranger, protecting land and managing resources, keeping human chaos from spilling over into the wild places. But it took a creature from a winter storm to teach her the greatest lesson the mountains had to offer: that protection sometimes means bearing witness, that love sometimes means letting go, that the world is still capable of harboring secrets so profound that their very existence makes existence matter more. She still works at the facility. She still keeps journals. She still drives the roads through the mountains when the weather permits. But she drives them differently now, with the understanding that she's not alone out there, with the knowledge that ancient things are moving through the trees, following paths that were ancient when her great-grandmother was young, that her father had understood something essential about the land, and that she had finally inherited his knowledge, the knowledge of when to speak and when to remain silent, when to document and when to simply bear witness, when to save and when to set free. Sometimes, in the deep of winter, she'll find a symbol scratched into a tree near the facility. 3 nested triangles, lines extending outward like communication across time and species and understanding. It appears maybe once a season, never in the same place, never in a pattern that suggests anything except intention. Margaret doesn't photograph it, doesn't report it. She just sees it and knows that somewhere in the mountains, in the deep forest where no human trail reaches, something is remembering her. Something is leaving its signature on the world. Something is saying, in its own wordless language, "I remember. I survived. I found my way home." And that, Margaret thinks, is enough. That is perhaps everything that matters. That in a world increasingly mapped and explained and categorized, there are still places where mystery gets to exist. Still creatures that the world doesn't acknowledge. Still forests that keep their deepest secrets close. And still, if you're very lucky, one person who understands that some things shouldn't be explained, that their power lies precisely in the fact that they remain unexplained, unproven, known only to those wise enough to believe without asking for evidence. The snow falls. The mountains remember. And somewhere in the dark, in the place between certainty and mystery, something wild moves through the trees wearing the shape of gratitude, the gratitude of something that was found and saved and finally released.